It's been interesting. There's some things that they were doing that were clearly inspired by some of the things Lyft were doing. My favorite is that
Yeah.
they have on-time pickup promise at the airport as they rolled out here. But there are some things that are different. Particularly, they have more experience managing fleets, right?
Mhm.
Because the onboarding in the US is an individual driver mostly, right? Coming on
Right.
being onboarded. And here it's mostly fleets, taxi fleets that are onboarded. So the dispatch software, the fleet onboarding, all of
Mhm.
that with that, there's so much we are going to be able to take. And, we just started onboarding some taxis in St. Louis. We now will be working with a team who has years of experience doing this. And I think there's so much for us to learn and build.
Jeremy Bird is the Executive Vice President of Driver Experience at Lyft, overseeing Lyft's product and experiences for the 1.4 million drivers who choose the platform every year. Bird oversees all of Lyft's supply and supply partnerships, including autonomous vehicles, fleets, livery, and their rental subsidiary FlexDrive. Jeremy, how are you doing today?
I'm doing well, Harry. How are you?
I'm doing well. And, I think I just read this press release about Lyft's Free Now acquisition, and it looks like you might need to add one more job to your title.
It's super exciting day for us, really becoming global, and yeah, excited to talk to you about it.
Yeah, no, I've been really wanting to chat with you and the Lyft team about this international expansion. I think it started with Canada. You guys announced the Free Now sort of acquisition, and then obviously it recently closed. And then you also have just started operations in Puerto Rico, which is a U.S. territory, but obviously a bit of a different market. So let's kind of start there. I mean, maybe you can kind of, take us one level up and talk about, sort of why and how and where Lyft is going international.
Yeah, it's exciting today. I make the joke that, you got a lot of airports in the US who claim to be international airports because they have flights to Canada,
Mhm.
right? I mean, going international. But I do think you mentioned that like over the last several years, we've been growing our Canadian presence. We're very proud of that. Recently, over the last month, we were able to finally get in and expand into Quebec to be able to get into the Montreal market and other places throughout Quebec, and that's exciting, right? And
Nice.
also learn in a French speaking part of the country. And then as you mentioned, Puerto Rico, which, not international in that sense, but expansion in terms of geography, and very excited about our entry there. So we've been growing the Canadian market. We've loved the year-over-year growth we've seen. We've loved what we've learned there. I think what's the moment for us is being in a place of strength where we could start really looking at the global landscape and saying what makes sense and how can we find a right partner. And that's what we've done in Free Now.
Yeah. So, I mean, Lyft, I think one of the things that, whenever people ask me about Lyft and what stands out and makes them unique, I think I've always sort of pointed to the fact that they were focused on the US, they were focused on maybe even North America with the Canadian expansion. Why the shift now? Because I feel like obviously it's pretty late in, well, I don't know, you tell me, is it late in a company's journey, to operate for 10, 12 years, then all of a sudden kind of go international?
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I think we're all, every company is unique in their own right. For us, I think when we started and we're competing against Uber and others, and every ride was sort of a negative in terms of the balance sheet. We
Hmm.
didn't have enough money to go internationally in a smart way, in a sustainable way.
Yeah.
Uh, and then, then you have COVID and several things that happened. We wanted to truly go global. It's been part of our ambition and interest for a long time, but we needed to make sure, and I think this is kind of what we've talked about in the past, that we were strong in North America, that we felt like
Hmm.
in a position where we could go international. And part of that is become a profitable company. So we can be looking at international from that perspective. And what's really interesting about Free Now is they're in a similar journey where over the last year or so, they've grown, they've become profitable. And so we're coming together at a position of strength, not in a position of weakness or needing to grow because you have to grow, but doing it in a way where you think we can do it sustainably, again, with the right partners.
Yeah. What do you think, if you had to narrow it down, what is the main impetus for going global? Is it, kind of, I guess, growth and shareholders? Is it just, like what is the reason to go global?
Yeah. I mean, there's several reasons, right? One is growth, right?
Hmm.
We are a growing company. We feel like we have something to offer. We wouldn't just go to grow for growth's sake.
Yeah.
When we were looking at markets, we're looking at like what parts of the world, do we want to be in? It's really a question of, can you provide something to customers that
Yeah.
makes a difference to riders and drivers and other partners? And if you can do that and grow sustainably, it makes a lot of sense. So I think those are the sort of big reasons. Obviously, we think, we will make us better in North America. Even when we talk about the partnership, the conversations I've had with Free Now folks, they have a ton of experience with fleets, with
Yeah.
fleet software, with fleet management. we're going to learn a ton from that that will help us be stronger for customers in the United States and Canada. And I think we can do the same for them here.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah,
So,
I'm in Barcelona, so when I say here, I mean for the folks at Free Now in Europe.
yeah. Oh, are you in Barcelona right now?
Yeah, just trying to, or like you have down in LA.
Never would have guessed, based off of your background for those who are watching on video.
Yeah.
So cool. So, let's sort of focus on Free Now a bit. Actually, I was in London last fall and, took a Free Now. So they're primarily a taxi operator and company, right? Can you share a little bit of the background on Free Now and then maybe we could dive into some of the specifics and synergies?
Yeah. So yeah, about 90% of the business of the rides they're in 9 countries in Europe. And as you mentioned, UK being one of them, 90% of that business is taxi app. So
Hmm.
get on the app, you get on the Free Now app and you're getting a ride and it's predominantly taxi. There's two reasons, or if you look at at Europe overall, the regulatory environment is very different than the US in the sense that in some countries, take Ireland, Greece, Italy, taxi is really, there isn't really what they call PHV,
Hmm.
per hire vehicle, very similar to like traditional rideshare in the US for your audience, isn't even allowed in certain countries. And then
Yeah.
there's a lot of regulatory hurdles to that. So they have predominantly been a taxi app through the sort of regulatory environment and grown that way. So if you're in London, they're the number one taxi app for black cabs.
Yeah.
They're the number one taxi app in a lot of different markets, Ireland, et cetera.
All right, so I'm reading a post of mine from 9 months ago about my Free Now experience. The process was pretty smooth. Ended up with a great driver named Simon. I also met my friend Tim Arnold from Free Now for a Guinness and learned more about the company. But this cab driver had been driving for 17 years since he was 25. So this was only one driver, but I think it was actually kind of representative of a lot of the drivers, like you said, right? This is there's mainly cab drivers. A lot of them, I feel like it was their profession, right? They're not like dipping in and out. He said he was not a big fan of Uber also, I remember. And his black cab, it was technically a plug-in electric vehicle. And I want to say that he actually purchased the vehicle himself at a cost of £100,000. I'm sure he got a loan or something like that. But I do remember it was interesting. I love the car. I love the vehicle. So it was a pretty interesting model. Very, very smooth experience, though. And, I just thought I'd throw in that anecdote because I did take a Free Now, just 9 months ago. So it's actually a company I'm somewhat familiar with.
Yeah, well, and when I came to meet the folks the first time, their headquarters is in Hamburg,
Yeah,
and it's a very similar experience. I think one of the things is like the taxi industry in Europe is very different than the taxi industry in the US. I mean,
definitely.
what you're talking about in London with the type of car, you're getting the black cab and the experience and service level's high, right?
Yeah.
And really the cars, the quality is
I mean,
very
this driver, I remember, okay, it's all coming back to me. He talked about the test you have to take, the knowledge, and how he liked the apps and all that, but he was like, he felt like he had a lot of really strong experience, knew the streets and all of that, right?
I mean, the black cab drivers in London, it's an incredible. I mean, the knowledge test they have to
Yeah.
take is incredible, and they're some of the most knowledgeable drivers you'll ever. It's a really impressive service level. And Free Now has been doing a lot of things to support that industry in London, including like subsidizing the tests and just being really like it's similar to Lyft in the sense that like a lot of the drivers here are cab drivers, and there's difference. And I have to tell both teams, you gotta folks here, like most of the drivers on the Lyft platform in the US are not full time, right? They're
Hmm.
driving as a grocery
Yeah.
worker or something else. And here it tends to be in the markets where taxi is regulatorily like prominent, that tends to be professional. So you got to understand it's a different
Yeah. Well,
yeah,
and that's sort of what, I think a lot of people have been to Europe, but honestly, I think a lot of people go to Europe and they open up the Uber app, right, to get a ride because that's what they have and that's what they're familiar with. It sounds like a lot of people open up the Lyft app too, and that's one of the reasons why you're interested in expanding. But I kind of want to highlight this because I think that, taxis here, obviously they don't have a great reputation. That's sort of why and where rideshare was born. I think it's a little different in Europe. I think the drivers might be a little bit better than taxi drivers here, more professional. The cars are for sure, like in London, I was sitting in a brand new $100,000 vehicle. I left a little review of my vehicle. It was pretty cool. The technology that was in the car, as I think you can kind of talk to the driver through a microphone, and it's seat 6 and handicap accessible. They're more professional. And then also the app actually works. Like you can get the Free Now app and, across Europe, and it works just like, the Lyft app here. So that isn't really the case in the United States. So I kind of want to just set the scene for folks who maybe haven't visited Europe or haven't actually used the Free Now app in Europe also.
Yeah, no, totally. And I think one of the things that we really like is, even though the driver experience or maybe driver background, driver profile is different across different markets from the US and Canada to Europe, we have the same ethos
Mm,
that really, like, as David's talked about, our, CEO so much about, we're focused on, we want to be a customer obsessed company. We're meeting drivers, we're listening to drivers, we're creating products that work for drivers. FreeNow
yeah.
has that mentality. I mean, I don't know if Tim, who you met with here, but everybody that you meet on the team has that belief in, how can we have drivers thrive? If they're thriving, we'll get more drivers on the platform. As more drivers get
Yeah.
on, EVs go down, riders have a better experience. And so we're excited to partner with them on that and learn.
Yeah. So, what's one specific idea? I'm sure you have a lot of ideas in your mind. You don't have to reveal the whole product roadmap, but what's one or two things that you think Lyft can take from Free Now, and maybe and maybe one in the near term and one in the medium to longer term that you might be able to apply to the business?
Yeah. It's been interesting. There's some things that they were doing that were clearly inspired by some of the things Lyft were doing. My favorite is that
Yeah.
they have on-time pickup promise at the airport that we
Nice.
rolled out here, as they rolled out here. But there are some things that are different. Particularly, they have more experience managing fleets, right?
Hmm.
Because the onboarding in the US is an individual driver mostly, right? Coming on
Right.
and being on, and here it's mostly fleets, taxi fleets that are onboarded. So the dispatch software, the fleet onboarding, all of
Mm.
that, with that, there's so much we are going to be able to take. And we just started onboarding some taxis in St. Louis. We now will be working with a team who has years of experience doing this, and I think there's so much for us to learn and build together.
Yeah. What's so like maybe take either a specific city or Free Now across the business. So I guess this driver that I happen to have in London, I believe he owned his own car. So he was sort of a single. Is that rare, or what's the sort of, is it half and half? Half of the vehicles on the Free Now platform are from, bigger fleet owners with dozens or hundreds or thousands of cars, or what's the sort of breakdown look like?
Yeah, it's different in every country, but
Mm,
generally it's much more towards the fleet side than the owner operator side.
gotcha.
The form is set up just like we are in the US to take
Okay.
either, but it's much more
So
fleet
I guess
focused.
a good analogy would be like the New York City market here in the United States, where there's a lot of big fleets with a lot of vehicles, since the drivers require commercial insurance and TLC licensing. But there are some owner operators who have been doing it for a while, who are really good, who are able to get a loan and kind of do it that way too, right?
That's right. That's right.
Okay, cool. So I think, yeah, I think that's helpful background on Free Now. What's one thing that you think they'll be able to take from Lyft and apply to their business model?
Yeah, there's a couple of things that we're talking about. I think one is, we just rolled out the new driver rewards program.
Hmm.
I'm very excited about it.
Yeah.
I think it's something that we'll be talking to them about. They have a rewards program, but can we kind of revamp it in the same way that we have in the US and Canada? And I've started to see, like, real benefits for drivers in that front. The other thing that we have done, we spent years developing our mapping technology,
Hmm.
and it's particularly useful in a market where there's taxi lanes. And, using a traditional map is not going to help you as much as a map that's designed for drivers, which I've always loved about ours. They even just pick up on the right side of the street,
Yeah.
just all the things from an app that wasn't designed for a rideshare or for an app. So excited about that.
Yeah. I mean, I know you guys have done a lot with the driver rewards, and you probably know that I always joke that, the number one driver reward people want is just more money. We can't always do that, right? So, I mean, I guess talk a little bit more about, sort of the driver rewards that you've, kind of offered here. And I mean, is it different there? Like, do they want, because they're more full-time, do they want more benefits, or do they also want more money?
Yeah, it is different. I mean, when you made the New York analogy, I think it's also, kind of New York, Seattle. It's in a lot of the markets, there's regulated pay, right? Essentially
Hmm.
regulated. And so whatever app you're on, if you're riding taxi, it's much more like New York, where there's kind of a set fee, but not always. It's not true for PHV in some places, and it's not true in some of the markets. And always, like anybody you're talking to, like, we want drivers to make more. And the
Hmm.
way that will make more in a regulated market, just like, anywhere in the US, is to have more rides.
Got it.
More demand, you're going to make more. And so we're excited about the 4.6 million people who have gone to one of these 9 countries in the last 18 months and opened the app and say the Lyft app and
Yeah.
look for, you say, we don't exist here. And now they'll
Yeah.
be able, the app that'll have more rides. We're going to focus on,
Yeah, I thought that stat was cool. Can you say it one more time? It was 4.6 million people over the past 18 months went to one of Free Now markets, opened the Lyft app, and obviously couldn't get a ride because Lyft isn't there.
yeah. And that's without, they know we don't exist outside, like,
Hmm.
most people know we're kind of we had been historically a, North America and mostly
Yeah.
US company. And so that will be obviously a lot larger when people know and we're able to market to them when they get there. So we're excited about that to add.
And what, for example, like how many rides does Lyft currently do on a weekly basis in the US?
It's, north of 2 million.
In a couple million. Okay. So it's, a decent, not a majority, but, the 4.6, but it would be, a
Yeah,
nice little percentage.
we're excited about that. And then, I think it was, 1.6 million folks from those free now markets coming to the US. And
Yeah.
opening the free now app in the US, and they're not existing. So we're excited to capture those and then build from there.
Yeah. So I mean, I guess that's sort of the network effects of, kind of having the Lyft app. And I guess to start, it's going to be prompting. If I open the Lyft app in a free now market, it'll prompt me to download free now. And then in the future, it'll be more of a seamless integration.
Yeah, absolutely. Yes.
Cool, cool. The other thing that stands out to me and that we've kind of touched on is obviously in Europe, there's a lot more support for labor. I kind of like to joke every time I go to Europe, somebody's on strike, which also is like kind of a joke, but also true. And especially in the summer, right? So I guess, is there anything there that Lyft, needs to think about or consider? Or, I mean, I know the market is kind of different, right? Because it's more taxi drivers, because it's more professional, because it's more regulated. I guess I'm guessing that there's some limits on the number of vehicles in some of these cities, for example. What do you guys sort of think about there? Because you're right, some of the markets in the US have kind of similar-ish type regulation too, right?
Yeah, the regulation is different in every market here, like it is, in the US. We don't have a law. We have a different, markets, and a lot of countries will look a little bit more like Illinois or Oregon, where there's not a statewide or like not a country individual market regulation. So we got to be smart about that. And like we said, there's some regulations around the number of licenses that are out there, and that's true for PHEV, personal hire vehicles, or tax labor markets. But your question about the labor piece, I think, is really important. And another reason why teaming up with Free Now is such a good partnership for us. They have really strong relationships with drivers, with the
Hmm.
fleet, and with unions throughout those 9 countries throughout Europe. And they've spent years building those relationships that if we were just trying to come in on our own and, do it the way some other companies might have done it in the
Yeah.
past, I don't think that's as effective as coming in with these folks they trust, they know,
Yeah.
and we're, continuing to do what they do, which is listen and make sure we're being a platform that they'll want to put their cars on.
Yeah. Well, and I mean, I think it's interesting, right? Because in the US, people get so used to opening up, their favorite rideshare app, and you can get a ride basically anywhere, 3 to 5 minutes. You can kind of even be out in the middle of, maybe not out in the middle of nowhere, but you can even be in a smaller city, right? In Europe, that's really not the case, right? It's not like you've got one app across all these markets. It's not like the consistent, you can go to Lake Como in the summer, which is like a huge tourist destination. You can't get a ride. Okay, that happened to me. That's how I know. You know what I mean? So it's like, I think that like consistent experience isn't there. So I guess, do you think that creates like a good opportunity for you? Because like you said, like you can't, Uber isn't I mean, they're a big player there in certain cities in certain ways, but like Free Now is probably, I think a very strong rival, because you can't just like go in there and, launch, sort of the traditional rideshare app. You kind of need to have all the local regulators and, sort of taxis and things like that.
Yeah, yeah, they've been really strong. They built up a strong brand presence throughout Europe.
Yeah.
But yeah, you're right. I think we've seen growth in the U.S. over the last couple of years, and we'll be
Mhm.
lower scale markets, sort of less dense markets, and to be able to get to be able to get a ride wherever you are, no matter if it's a rural place or whatever. And you've seen that. So they've been growing in. I consider tier 2 or tier 3 markets. They went from the time we signed with them in April, and we kind of closing with them. They went from 150 cities to 180 cities. So 30 new cities. They weren't in Glasgow and Scotland before, and now they exist there. We want to really grow so that, you have that experience in the 9 countries. There are sure to go anywhere in Germany and be able to get, Free Now. We want to continue to do that throughout the system. And then there are other places where they don't exist today that are other countries in Europe where
Mm.
they have a really strong reason to go to customers and say, this is a great app, great experience, and we're going to provide a better experience for drivers and riders in, Switzerland or Portugal or,
Yeah.
Belgium, other places where they could exist.
What do you think is the biggest difference for drivers is going to be in those markets, versus, your United States, for example?
Well, it depends on the regulations, right?
Mhm.
So in the taxi regulated markets, obviously the driving experience is different. And you mentioned it already. I think there's much more throughout Europe. There's many more professional drivers, right? We have a cohort in the US of drivers, we consider loyalists. Their source of earnings comes from the app. much more of that is going to be much more of what those drivers experience in the US will be similar to here versus the 10-hour a week, 5-hour a week drivers that you have in the US. Now, that's
Got it.
not true for every country. Like Poland, for example, they do have many more drivers that look similar to the US where they're not full
Mhm.
time and they have full time drivers. So we'll be looking at that mix and, you got to figure
Yeah.
out, the number one thing is to understand the drivers, to listen to them, and then you can build products that make sense for them.
For sure. Well, and I imagine that, if I'm thinking about Lyft's US drivers, obviously they all love the flexibility, they love product features like Express Pay. So I don't know if Free Now, kind of has their own version of Express Pay, but that would be one to me on the product side that I imagine would be a no-brainer. And then kind of like elements of that flexibility, right? Because I think that's even if you drive full time, like being in control, even if you have to work 50 hours a week, right? Being in control of that 50 hours or, being able to take a week off, obviously if you're renting a car from a fleet owner, like you got to have a vacation at some point, you know what I mean? Like kind of building that in. So I think that those elements of flexibility, I imagine, they probably might not be getting because it's more of a traditional, taxi fleet owner setup.
Yeah, I mean, your Express Pay example is a great example, right? We want that to be here as soon as possible.
Mm,
It's to be able to get paid, in that way. And also we have Lyft Direct, which is not something that drivers have here, which is
mm.
not only the Express Pay, get the Express Pay with no fees and have benefits that are associated. That's where ultimately we'll want to, those are the kinds of things we want to do together.
Very cool. So a lot of good info on the Free Now acquisition. Congrats on that. Definitely excited to see where that goes. The other market that I wanted to touch on was Canada because they are our neighbors to the north. And I think I was doing some research recently, and I feel like the population, I'm not even going to try to quote it, but I feel like Canada has a pretty big population, like kind of sneaky big. I don't think that they maybe do the volume of rides as the US, like relative to the population. But it seems like Lyft is having a lot of success. Or talk a little bit about the Canadian market and sort of how that fits into Lyft strategy.
Huge part of our strategy, big part of our international strategy. And we grew there organically and have done it over time. But I think really in the last couple of years, it really kind of doubled down on our commitment to Canada.
Mm,
And you gotta be, it's kind of what we talked about with Europe. You want to be everywhere in the country. You don't want to be, oh, if I'm in Toronto, I can get it. Yeah. And so there's kind of similar to Europe in that we had to get, you have to kind of open up each market and
mm,
even open up Toronto, but then you got to go open up the sort of surrounding areas. And so we're excited about that because we've been expanding, even though we've been in Canada for a while, we've been expanding in Canada. And I think we can continue to see more of that and making sure that, it's again, different market, but making sure that the products that make sense for drivers and riders in Canada, that we have them, tailored to the Canadian experience, but also,
yeah.
don't have any products that would be great that they're not experiencing.
Yeah, and you mentioned something interesting. I mean, kind of, you're right. It doesn't make a lot of sense to go into one or two cities in Canada because of the, obviously a lot of people within Canada, I'm sure, travel all over the place, right? So you kind of need to be in all of the top cities. Toronto. Okay, now I'm looking at the population. Toronto, Montreal, Vancouver, Calgary, Edmonton, Ottawa are sort of the top cities by populations. You sort of need to be in all of the big ones, right?
For sure. And now that we're in Montreal, what you don't want a user, a rider to do, right? If you're traveling, say you live in Ottawa and we were in
Mhm.
Ottawa and you travel to Montreal, you don't want them not to be able to open the same app, right? They should have the
Right.
same experience, be able to open the app there. And so as we expanded throughout, the whole country, I think that's really huge for us going forward.
Yeah. Any other unique opportunities or challenges in the Canadian market?
I mean, it's very similar to what we've been talking about with Europe.
Yeah.
Vancouver is so different than Toronto,
Mhm.
different than Ottawa, it's different than Montreal in terms of like the regulatory environment, but also the consumers are different, the
Yeah.
density is different, the populations are different. But going in with a customer obsessed approach and having folks on the ground who understand the market it makes us strong.
Yeah. Awesome. Well, last question I wanted to ask you about is sort of how this international expansion fits into Lyft's overall business. I think obviously I would say maybe the core business is sort of giving rides in the United States, but you also have your sort of micromobility operations, scooters and bikes. You mentioned fleets. I think fleets is an interesting one because that also dovetails into autonomous vehicles, which I know you're spending a lot of time in. So how does this kind of fit in, to Lyft's overall business strategy going forward?
Yeah, I think the nice bit is that we call it LUS, which is the Lyft Urban Solutions. That's our bike and scooter
Mhm.
vision. That has been international for a long time.
Mhm.
Operates in big cities, kind of all over the world. Actually, I'm in Barcelona, right? And the main bike system in Barcelona, we make the bikes.
Oh, wow.
We don't operate the system. It's operated by the city, but we make the bikes, and so it's hardware, software, and then operating the bike systems that we do. in various places across the world. And so that's exciting because there's a lot of synergy you can see with the Free Now acquisition, but also just the global,
Yeah.
just
Well, and
overall.
obviously, and in Europe too, I mean, public transportation, biking is much, much bigger than in the United States. So I think that's kind of, an interesting opportunity too.
And then, yeah, so it's like that synergy with us, and then just, yeah, growing the business overall. And like you mentioned, learning, growing our fleets operation, growing our driver base, growing our riders. And we're now 50 million riders on the platform in the Lyft ecosystem, which is exciting.
Cool. I mean, on the Lust side, to me, like, when I've been in New York City and I take the, Lyft city bikes, I love the e-bikes cruising around. Like, I guess to me, that seems like a really strong, and I know that they have really strong numbers and ridership and all of that. Like, seems like a really strong opportunity. And I know you guys have some kind of bundle to bundle that with Lyft rides, where basically, like, it has to, like, you should get like a major discount to do bike rides and Lyft. And that should like kind of be, that seems like such a unique advantage. And I know not everyone loves the bikes. If you're dressed to the nines for a meeting, maybe you don't want to hop on a bike or an e-bike, but I probably would. But, I think it's like a very good way to get around in New York City.
I'd love to see you dressed in the nines, Harry.
Yeah, I don't think it takes a lot to get me to put on a suit. So
Like that. And if you've been on the bikes, like it's an amazing.
I mean, every time I go to New York, I always, cruise along the Hudson bike path, and on the Lyft, I only take the e-bike. So that's sort of good and bad. But yeah, I really love the product. It's really, I love getting around. I only bike on kind of the safer streets where there's protected lanes. I know there's a lot of issues right now with that, but so I try to keep it pretty safe. But yeah, it's a great way, I think, to get around.
Yeah, so we're excited about that, and already having kind of the footprint and working with cities and other partners in Europe. Hopefully, this will, because we'll be able to couple that with like the on the ground presence and the relationships on the regulatory side
Mhm.
now has, and that will make our less business stronger.
Do you think Lyft is doing a good enough job right now, sort of bundling those bikes with rides in New York City, or do you think that'll be a focus, even more so now that they'll have that opportunity? It sounds like you'll have some cities where you actually are the bike share operator and, kind of paired with Free Now too, very similar to New York.
We're not. We want to do better there and make sure that I think in general, our sort of loyalty and membership programs for riders, whether you're riding bus or riding rideshare, like we hope to be strengthening that going
Yeah.
forward. And that's
Yeah. Like I feel like, since that bike aspect is so like it should be painful to not take a Lyft ride in New York City, right? Because you're getting such a good deal or such a good discount because you also bundle it with the bikes.
yeah.
But
Sometimes during rush hour in New York, we have more bike rides than rideshare rides. I
wow.
mean, it's used very heavily, and it exists, kind of all over the city. It's a
Yeah.
huge
And
asset.
of course it, sort of helps with congestion and all of the sort of policy side of things that regulators care about. So really last thing I want to ask you about. So I guess the fleets and the AV strategy, I know this is something you and I have talked about recently on a podcast, but how does the, sort of fleets side of, Free Now, does it fit into the AV strategy at all? Is there, I know that there's Moya, actually, I think they're in Hamburg, so I think there's a couple synergies there with Europe, but is there anything specific on the AV side that you mentioned fleets too? I know you guys are getting a lot into.
Yeah, I mean, for us, it's like we're doing in the U.S. Our kind of approach will be similar here, which is one, we want to grow the pie. We want to figure out a way to have a hybrid network. It's got to go through a regulatory process, right? And so again, Free Now's strong relationships on that side will be helpful. And yeah, the fleet operators you really need is with the AVs, right? You need the demand side, the
Mhm.
marketplace, and fleet operations side. They've got a lot of experience, in both of those, so we'll be working closely with them on that strategy moving forward.
Got it. I mean, I think one thing I feel like that's going to be because of the strong labor support. Do you envision there'll be sort of more resistance to AVs in Europe versus the US? Like, I think I saw there's big protests in city council in Boston right now. Like, they really don't want Waymo coming to Boston, right? So, do you think that'll be even stronger in Europe?
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, on the one hand, like you already see these pilots happening throughout Europe with cities, and a lot of
Yeah.
it is public transit. It's an early pilot, but you've seen them in Switzerland, and you mentioned Moya in Hamburg, and there was an article out a couple days ago about I don't know 50 or so mayors in Italy talking about wanting to be innovators in the
Hmm.
AV space. So
Cool.
I think there'll be a balance, right? Like we have in like you're mentioning in Boston, but I think if we do it right and we go in with that sort of we're gonna make sure drivers are part of the conversation like we have in the US. We're going to make sure
Yeah.
regular we're working with them. I think we can do it in a way that is, sustainable and a smart way to do it.
Cool. Well, seems like you've got a great partner in Free Now, and congrats on the expansions to Canada, Europe, now Puerto Rico, and everywhere else. So I hope to continue to use Lyft on my travels around the globe in the future. Looking forward to it. Thanks, Jeremy.
Harry, thank you. Good talking with you.
Thanks for watching today's episode of the Rideshare Guy podcast. For more information on today's guest, please check the description. Now, you don't want to miss this interview of the Rideshare Guy podcast, so click here and also make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss any future ones. See you next time.